We are so excited to welcome you to today's Right to Zero DMV workshop. On behalf of Earthjustice, we're thrilled to host this event in collaboration with many of our amazing partners. My name is Jill Tauber. I'm the Vice President of Litigation for Climate and Energy here at Earthjustice. Earthjustice is a non-for-profit environmental law organization with 14 regional offices across the country, including one right here in DC. We focus on protecting people's health, preserving magnificent places and wildlife, combating the climate crisis, and advancing a just and equitable 100% clean, zero emissions future. And core to our work is partnership. We work with many of you and are looking forward to continuing and deepening existing partnerships and building new ones. And we're here today to talk about 3 bodies of work that are critical to cutting pollution, to protecting health, to addressing long-standing inequities and injustices, and combating the climate crisis. These areas of work in the power, transportation, and building sectors are foundational to our Right to Zero campaign. We launched Earthjustice's Right to Zero campaign in the DMV area late last year to help advance a zero emissions future with clean air and clean energy for all. We know many of you have been working on these important issues for a long time, and we're looking forward to exchanging ideas today and working together in this moment of great possibilities. So today we're going to have 3 mini panels, about 30 minutes long for each, focusing on the power, transportation, and building sectors. We'll be facilitating discussion with our wonderful partners and advocates, diving into what we've accomplished to date and what we have on the horizon. We'll have some time for questions at the end of each panel, and we would encourage you to use the Zoom Q&A box to your right and send any questions to our panelists. We really want today to be a participatory event. So to help us do that, we would love for you to start by dropping your name and your affiliation in the chat. Let us know who you are, what brought you here today. We'll also be asking some questions in the chat throughout the event. We invite you to share your thoughts, share your suggestions, additions, ideas, in response to those questions. And I believe the first question will be coming your way shortly. And that's going to be, what is your dream blue sky outcome for zero emissions policies in 2021 at the local, state, or federal level? I mentioned earlier, but you can use the Q&A box on Zoom to send any additional questions your way. And feel free, if you are a tweeter, if you're on Twitter, you can find us at Right to Zero DMV. And the 2 is the 2 TO, not the number 2. So Right to Zero DMV will be tweeting during this event. We are going to be recording today, so please note that. We want to make sure this workshop is accessible to our partners. And without further ado, I'm happy to introduce the first micro panel. I'm going to kick things off by sending the event to Susan Miller. She's a staff attorney in Earthjustice's Clean Energy Program. She's based in our DC office, and she's going to talk with our partners about advancing a pollution-free, zero emissions clean energy grid. Susan has been working to clean up the power grid at Earthjustice for over 7 years. And before that, she played leadership roles in the Maryland Commission. She was the general counsel of the Maryland Public Service Commission and also worked at FERC. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it to Susan. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill, and thank you for that nice introduction. Thanks to all of you for attending today's discussion. We have a great first panel today on the importance of moving the DMV to a 100% zero emissions energy grid. Earthjustice's work in this area includes cases on rooftop and community solar, opposing the extension of gas facilities, and supporting energy efficiency programs, among other things. We are lucky to have with us today 2 experts who have been working tirelessly on achieving Maryland's climate and clean energy objectives. I'm going to give a very brief summary of their background and expertise, which does not do them justice at all, so that we can actually get to the question. Our first panelist is Delegate Lorig Charkoudian. The delegate is a member of the Maryland House of Delegates representing District 20, which is in Montgomery County. She is a member of the Economic Matters Committee, which has jurisdiction over Energy and Public Service Commission matters. Since her election, Delegate Charkoudian has worked extensively on energy matters. Her background includes a BA in mathematical economics and a PhD in economics from Johns Hopkins University. Our other panelist today is Corey Ramsden. Many of you undoubtedly know Corey due to his extensive work on solar issues on behalf of Solar United Neighbors in Maryland. Formerly, Corey was the Maryland Program Director, and in this capacity, he developed and supported solar co-op buying groups all over Maryland. He also conducted public solar education and outreach activities across Maryland. Currently, Corey is the Vice President of the Go Solar programs at Solar United Neighborhoods, where he leads a team in support of project-based fieldwork across 13 states. Sadly, the other states' gains is Maryland's loss, obviously. This team provides direct technical support to communities interested in developing community-shared renewable projects. Just one example of his current work is managing a grant from DC to deliver rooftop solar to income-qualified homeowners. Before we get started, I would like to remind everyone to please share any questions you may have in the Q&A box. And first, I would like to ask each of our panelists to provide a brief overview of their current work and priorities. Could we start with you, Delegate Charkoudian?
Great, thank you. It's such an honor to be here. I have such extraordinary respect for Earthjustice and the work you've been doing, and so many other people on this panel, and the work all of y'all have been doing. And so I'll just briefly, I think I'll talk briefly about some of the pieces of legislation I'm focused on this year in the General Assembly, in addition to really looking for opportunities to promote all of the clean energy legislation that's coming through the General Assembly. A couple of the focus areas that I have this year are, one of them is on energy efficiency, which I understand is a subsequent panel. And I see that Jamal Lewis will be on there. I've been working with Green Healthy Homes Initiative and NRDC on ensuring that we have a goal for low-income energy efficiency in the state. Folks probably know that Empower has been a real model and a leader across the country on improving energy efficiency. But of course, it's been done in a way that's extraordinarily inequitable. And we've left behind the folks who have, who would benefit the most in terms of the financial savings, but also, of course, folks who have also been harmed most by climate change and fossil fuels. And so the bill establishes a goal and sets some accountability for DHCD in terms of low-income energy efficiency. The second area that I'm focused on is the Public Service Commission's consideration of climate in all deliberations, climate and labor. And this really came out of some decisions that I believe Earthjustice was involved in at the PSC, where they explicitly said that their direction and their efforts on needing to consider the environment did not require them to consider climate and climate change in their deliberations. And so now we're changing the statute so that they do have to consider that, as well as labor. I have been looking at opportunities to tie together decisions about climate and clean energy with decisions about labor. So as we're bringing in a cleaner grid, we're doing it in a way that's growing jobs that have high labor standards, wages, benefits, and union opportunities, apprenticeships, and so on. And related to that, a third big area that I'm focused on is geothermal, where we're looking to grow the geothermal industry in general in the state, but specifically to do it in a way that, in partnership with the labor unions, especially many of whom who currently work on pipelines, and doing it, and then also connecting it to carve-outs to ensure that we direct a good portion of the geothermal investments into low-income communities. So those are a couple of highlights for this year, and I'm happy to take additional questions.
Thank you, Delegate Charkoudian. Now we'll turn to Corey for a brief summary of his current work.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Susan and Jill and Earthjustice, for the invitation. It's an honor to be here today, especially on a panel with Delegate Charkoudian. And thank you for all your work in the State House in Maryland as a tireless champion for renewables. We certainly appreciate it. Solar United Neighbors works actually in all three of the states in the area, Virginia, DC, and Maryland. And across all three of those states, some of the common themes that we're focusing on and have for a number of years, and this year is no different, is really making sure that people have direct access to solar, rooftop, and community solar. And that looks a little different in each of the states depending on where those policies are. So for example, and I'll work my way towards Maryland, but in Virginia, where community solar was just recently passed, that for us looks like at the regulatory level, making sure that the program gets implemented in a way that really benefits everyone and doesn't provide barriers for those who want to participate either intentionally or unintentionally around projects that maybe are less standard than your large scale projects. Sometimes regulations, for example, don't encourage small scale communities to creating projects. And there's some minutia there that we're particularly, I think, well suited to work with at the regulatory level, and often have done it so in the past with Earthjustice. In DC, for a program that already has community solar and has been there for a while, for us, it really is making sure that that program continues to extend benefits to everyone in the city through the city's Solar for All program. We're not directly involved at this point because our grant is over, but we're very much focused on making sure that the current rollout of that program continues to be aggressive, and making sure that everyone in the city has access to both rooftop and a community solar services in the city. It's I think one of the leading programs in the country for doing that. It benefits a lot from the city's SREC market, but I think what it comes down to is an intention by government officials to make sure that that access is there, and support from communities to make sure that the program stays healthy. So we're going to continue to do that in DC. And then in Maryland, it is very much, again, on community solar, making sure that that program continues to show that it can be successful. It's in a pilot right now. So every day, every week, every year of the program is a way and an opportunity for us to prove that it not only can create access for people who don't have good roofs or have good credit, but that it can create access and real savings for people who are low and moderate income qualified for the program, and doing so in a way that doesn't make their access challenging for them. So making sure that income qualification and verification processes, for example, are straightforward. And then the last part of that in Maryland, which we'll see probably in other states as well, is really trying to find a better set of compromises so that community solar and other solar can flourish in places where right now there's a lot of conflict around solar siting. So looking for opportunities, for example, for agrivoltaics to work well with solar, to be able to create opportunities to reduce some conflict on where solar should go, because ultimately in 2021 and moving forward, it's an all of the above approach. We need to make sure that solar it can work in all of the places where we know it can, and that the barriers are reduced as much as possible. So we do that through projects, and we do that through policy, and we combine them together to activate people to advocate in their own interests in all three of those locations. So thanks, looking forward to the questions.
Thank you very much, Corey. Now I'm going to start with some questions of my own, and hopefully the attendees will begin to participate as well. Delegate Charkoudian, I'd like to start with you. In your view, how can advocacy groups better advocate for clean energy legislation in Maryland?
Wow, I think
start with the easy one.
The easy one, how to do it. Yeah. So, well, many of you have done an extraordinary job. In fact, we just, well, on the House side, I'm not sure where it is in the Senate, we just raised the net metering cap to 3,000, which I actually thought would take a little bit longer than just this year. So, so someone's doing some really good work, Corey. Yeah, so I think I actually been thinking about this. I think that we do have a lot of strong clean energy policies. We also have a long way to go in Maryland. But I think one of the thoughts I've had recently, actually, that I'll just throw out now and invite folks to work with me on over the interim is, I think one of the challenges with things like energy is that people have conceptually have an idea about it. But energy policy can be a little bit elusive. It's hard to put your hands on. And so the closer you can get to like looking at, for example, I had geothermal installed in my house this year, and I invited members of my committee to come and see it. And this is like brief opportunity to see it, like when the earth is open and you're looking at the pipes. And now you can't really see anything, which is one of the sort of advantages, right? But I do feel I'm here in my house, and I feel like Mother Earth is wrapping her arms around me and keeping me nice and warm. But this idea of how do you help people see what this actually means? And one of the thoughts I've had is that I actually think that folks like Solar United Neighbors, others who do work on energy efficiency and so on, that we might put together like a dog and pony show that could be used in people's local town halls. A lot of us have town halls. We need to be talking to our constituents about things. And when we talk to our constituents, we want to talk about policies, but we also often want to talk about constituent services, what could benefit them directly. And so, so I've been thinking that it would be really advantageous to be able to say to me and my colleagues, when you have your next town hall, can we come and talk about how they could enroll in community solar, how they could benefit from Empower, whether that's Empower accessing it through the utilities or accessing it through DHCD for low-income housing, so that folks can start to like make a direct connection between their constituents and the benefits of the policies that we have been passing that are both about access to clean energy, but also broader equity in that access to clean energy. And I think that that may be a new strategy that I think we haven't really used yet in Maryland. And I would love the opportunity to work with a lot of the groups here to see if we could put something together that then, you know, we could encourage my colleagues to do. I think when people start to see those direct benefits, and especially because this myth about the myth of sort of clean energy is more expensive, so protecting ratepayers means slow walking clean energy. I think that's kind of this really dangerous myth that the fossil fuel industry has been very successful at getting out there. And so the more that we can tie the connections directly for folks between folks in their communities who struggle with the bills and helping make the connection between those folks, energy efficiency and clean energy for them directly, I think the more that my colleagues and I can wrap our heads around what this means. And I think then that puts us in a stronger position to then strengthen the legislation going forward.
Thank you. Corey, now to you. Kind of related, how can we encourage community solar adoption and rooftop solar adoption throughout the DMV?
Definitely very related. And I appreciate the dog and pony show suggestion and idea there, because one of the things that we see on the community solar side in particular is it's just still a lot of information and education that needs to be done for the general public. One thing that we run into a lot, and others have as well, especially for communities that maybe in the past have maybe been taken a little bit of advantage of when it comes to retail electricity supply and some of those contracts, is that community solar looks and feels very similar. So there's some trust issues there that I think we all need to work hard to get over. And I think it's worth it for us to spend time to do that, because the reality is that the products that are coming out of the community solar marketplace, they are in fact good products that create savings for people. And in certain categories, it can create even more savings depending on the project. But in order for us to get past that, it really does take some intention and outreach into different communities, doing information sessions, having neighbors have the information to be able to share it with each other. We see this in rooftop all the time. And I think it's true for both really rooftop solar and community solar, which is that when your neighbors have something and they like it and they talk about it, it becomes more prevalent. And then that continues to grow, but you have to start somewhere there. So that's the state, being intentional about educating communities and local jurisdictions. It's community organizations being intentional about talking to their networks and their friends. And there are plenty of organizations that do this, and we're certainly one of them. We're happy to come and talk to anybody at any time to present and talk about either or rooftop and community solar. And just to give you one example, we just launched a co-op for counties north of Baltimore. And I think maybe for the first time, what we're really doing in that co-op, rather than just talking about rooftop solar, is also incorporating community solar into the education work we do there, just because they're two sides of the same coin. We want people to have that info, so that if somebody ends up on our doorstep looking to install rooftop and that might not be a good fit for them, or maybe it is, but their neighbor can't, they'll know what to do. They'll know how to connect that person to another offering that still lets them connect to community solar directly in Maryland. So that's one, is the education. The second part, which I think is something also that happens at the local level, is really just like no barrier is too small to focus on. We see this time and time again, whether it's an HOA that's got restrictive positions against solar, making sure they know what their requirements are. And that's true for Virginia, for DC, and for Maryland, is HOAs can really throw a wrench in the gears, even if they're in theory not supposed to be able to do that, or they have limitations. And the same thing's true for permitting, right? Following up with jurisdictions and making sure that those processes are smooth, that they're staffed appropriately, that the fees are, fair, and all of those things just take constant attention to kind of keep things moving. So we encourage people when they run into issues to reach out to us, to others, and to just, not just deal with it, but actually make an attempt to advocate for improving those issues, whether it's with a local person in their local representative or somebody that's representing them in Annapolis, is to speak up and to share their experience so that those things can be improved.
Thank you, Corey. Delegate Charkoudian, how do you view the legislator's relationship with the Public Service Commission?
Well, as sometimes I like to remind folks, we actually set the statute that they then follow. So I think that, so, I've only been in office for 3 years. So this is my third session. So two and a half sessions. I don't know, last year was a sort of a 2/3 of a session. And in that time, I think I've worked really hard to build a stronger relationship with the PSC. It's hard for me to sort of compare because I don't know what things have been like in the past. I think that, as I was saying earlier about energy policy, sometimes feeling it's hard to put your hands on. I think this is where there are very complicated regulations, of course, within energy policy, and the PSC, as the regulatory agency, manages a lot of those pieces. And then, of course, there's the interactions and interconnections between what's decided at the level of PJM and then what's regulated by FERC, and how much power and control can we have within the state. And that's like a whole nother set of issues I know many folks here have worked on. But I think that I do think it's really important to be in an ongoing conversation with the Public Service Commission, because I think that while we need to set the broader constructs within which they're functioning, and this is where my bill to require that they consider climate change and labor issues in their deliberations, I think is important. That's a sort of broader construct. I do think so much can get done in the nitty gritty. And I think, the community solar is a really good example of that, where, we felt like we set a pretty clear direction as a legislature about our goals for community solar, and especially LMI access. And then I know that there were a lot of details that took a very long time to work out at the Public Service Commission level. So I think it's really important to be engaged in an ongoing basis as we're setting policy and as they're implementing policy, and then be willing on our end to adjust our direction to them if we weren't clear, the first time around. I think it sort of is an ongoing dance and conversation that we need to stay in.
Thank you. And as a follow-up to that, how can advocates either pressure the Public Service Commission or encourage the Public Service Commission to take actions in support of clean energy and in support of the state's climate goals?
Well, yeah, so this is where I think Corey's point about what did you say, Corey? Like nothing is too nitty gritty or tiny or that is where there are these very big picture things we have to get right. And then, of course, things can come to a grinding halt because of permitting issues, or because of documentation issues. And so, so I do think it's really important to stay on top of, and I know that Earthjustice does a great job of this. A lot of the advocates in some of these other areas do a really good job of staying on top of the deliberations of the Public Service Commission. And then sharing that with me, right? I mean, a lot of my best legislation I have because the NRDC and GHHI came to me and said, okay, we've been trying to get this energy efficiency thing through PSC for the last 3-4 years, and we're not getting it done there. Would you put in legislation? Similarly with the legislation on the PSC consideration of climate, and I was prepared to do some stuff on community solar and LMI documentation. And then I think things ended up getting worked out. So I do think it is very important to stay involved in the nitty gritty of the conversations at the PSC, and know that I and probably others in the General Assembly stand ready to clarify and give clearer direction to the PSC if that's necessary, if you're finding that in those nitty gritty conversations, there isn't enough statutory direction to accomplish the clean energy goals that we have.
Susan, can I add a story to that on the advocacy side?
Sure.
We one thing that I tell the story periodically is just sort of an example of how it doesn't really take that many people speaking up and connecting with the Public Service Commission to make a difference. They're public servants; they want to hear from the public, but it's hard for the general public to engage. There are lots of details, meetings at weird times, minutia, and thanks to Earthjustice, I mean we rely on them quite a bit to keep track of things, but. A couple years ago, there was a revision to the interconnection standards for solar, and one of the things that was in there was a fee for level 1 interconnections, which is pretty much every rooftop installation in the state. And that fee was not there before, and they had added it in, and it was relatively small, administrative, but still a tiny barrier. Everybody in that meeting was either a utility company or an industry person, except for one person. He had called me and said, "Hey, I want to do something about this." I'm not sure how he learned about it. So I gave him some coaching on how to go to the meeting and how to sign up for testimony, all the sort of the mechanics of it. He showed up. He was the only person there aside from the usual suspects. He spoke in support of waiving the fee, and it got their attention. I mean, he wasn't the only one speaking on that behalf, but a single citizen showed up, said that, said his piece, and they appreciated it. And it turned out to be the only thing that didn't get, that got changed in that set of regs. Everything else went through exactly the way it was written. They flipped that and they actually took the fee out. So just an example of how it doesn't really take a lot of volume sometimes. It just takes people who are committed and are able to, to interact with the commission, because the bar for public participation sometimes is so low. So anyways, just wanted to share that. It's a hopeful story.
Thank you, Corey. That's actually a great example. Turning to you now, aside from the fee issue you just mentioned, what would you view as the impediments to implementing the different kind of solar in Maryland?
In Maryland, I think for rooftop things are, for the most part, they're pretty good, right? The jurisdictions, I think, are encouraging rooftop solar, and they try to process permits in a timely fashion, and all the sort of the nitty gritty of it seems to work pretty well. Some counties may be faster than others, but I think in general that push is there, and support for rooftop is pretty widely across all the political spectrum. People are engaged and would like to see it. On the community solar side, I think the big challenge here, and has been for a number of years, is just zoning and siting. All the counties that potentially have the space to host community solar on the ground are all wrestling with where and how to put this. And some folks are interested in seeing it in agricultural areas, and others have concerns. I think a lot of which are legitimate about making sure that things get done in a way that sort of honors the fabric of those communities and the history of agricultural production. But there's some really good solutions to combine those together and really make that work. But it takes effort to do it right. And we just continue to see that struggle playing out in different counties. And for every county that it makes it hard and makes it challenging for us to be able to expand the program, not just on rooftops where it is also happening, but on the ground, makes it just that much harder for us to reach our shared goals. So I look forward to us being able to collaborate with folks on both sides of the conversation through things like agrivoltaics, where we're starting to see some good traction there. We had a webinar last week that had 160 some odd people from all over the country, in particular Maryland, learning about how that works, and the benefits to the land and to the soil, is also to the farmers and landholders in terms of the economics of running their businesses. So I think that's maybe one of the main things to highlight in Maryland, is that siting issue, and just making sure that we find solutions as quickly as possible so that the program can continue to flourish.
Thank you. Delegate Charkoudian, where do you find the opposition to transforming the grid to a clean energy grid comes from, and what's the best way to kind of confront and address that opposition?
Well, I think that I think it's important to know that some of the opposition that we hear, I think a lot of the opposition that we hear, and this isn't a surprise to anyone who's on this, is sort of fueled quietly by the fossil fuel industry creating sort of myths and ideas about clean energy. And that ranges from sort of um, the stories about view sheds and the concepts of you know, wind turbines ruining view sheds and solar panels ruining view sheds to the idea of clean energy not being reliable, or that it's not possible to get to 100% clean energy with reliability, to the idea that clean energy is too expensive. And so those kind of concepts that I think have been sort of fueled and pushed out very effectively, surprisingly effectively by the fossil fuel industry, you know, capture then legitimate concerns that legislators have. So concerns about pricing and concerns about reliability. And so then I think it becomes our job to effectively communicate exactly what it does look like to get from here to there, exactly what it does look like from a technological perspective, from a technology perspective, what 100% clean energy grid could look like and how we get from here to there. I think it's very important to engage and have the conversations about how we are protecting ratepayers and why it is that rates are higher, and how in the long term this shift actually saves ratepayers money, and how the very same grid upgrades that bring on more renewables are the same grid upgrades that create greater reliability for our system. I think it can get very technical, and so it's much easier for people to go, oh yeah, solar and wind isn't always running, so that must be bad for reliability. And yet the broader structural transformations we need for 100% clean energy are also the same structural transformations we need for a more reliable grid and resilient grid. But it just takes a couple more steps. It's harder to put that on a bumper sticker, right? And so I think this is where there is some of these hard conversations that we have to be able to have with folks about the reality of what that transition is going to look like. So that's one. I think the other one is that we do have to really look at the issue of labor and what kind of jobs we have in the new clean energy world that we're building. And this is why, as I said, when we worked on the Public Service Commission legislation to incorporate climate into every decision that the PSC makes, we've also incorporated labor into those decisions, because there's this recognition that as we're building a new kind of a future, we want to be building that future with equity front and center and with labor standards front and center. Because if we don't, we're sort of repeating the similar problems, that we're just repeating another set of problems. That kind of creates an unjust world. And so I think that one of the challenges has been there's so much that our economy has shifted away from good jobs. And so newer industries, as they develop, there's likely to be a great deal of pressure on them for the low cost labor, I guess. And so it's really important that we're engaging on an ongoing basis with labor unions, with clean energy industry, so that we're really, and with policymakers, so that as we grow the clean energy industry, we're doing it in a way that's transforming also the kinds of jobs that are available. And I think that, again, those are not easy conversations on bumper stickers, but they are really crucial conversations. And if we don't get those right, it's going to be much harder to make the shift to the clean energy future that we want.
Thank you. Keying off of Delegate Charkoudian's statement, Corey, how does equity factor into the Solar United Neighborhoods strategies?
It's in the middle of it. It's kind of everything that we talk about, I think, has to have that focus, because the reality is that this transition, like any other transition from one major industry to another, if we're not intentional about that, folks are going to get left behind. And that has a variety of different solutions along the way, and we're sort of always looking for places that we can push different solutions forward, or in some cases even implement and practice them. So just to give you a couple of examples, on the rooftop side, in places like DC with Solar for All, the policymakers have made a specific choice to allocate some budget dollars that have come in from the renewable energy program to encourage and to support direct access for rooftop owners. That creates other opportunities along the way. In Maryland, maybe it looks different. Maybe it's the Green Bank. I know Montgomery County is certainly working on that through their Green Bank, but financing that is appropriate, that creates cash savings, in every month of that interaction from year one for somebody who's income qualified. Making that savings apparent and available up front is important, and it's not going to happen by itself right now. And the same is true for, in some cases, even being able to, talk about direct buy down of a loan or a grant. And I know those are hard conversations to have in the current economic and budget climates, but they're not going to get any easier. And in the meantime, people are potentially going to be left behind. And we saw in the DC program, just to give an example, the people who ended up engaging with that program through our particular grant, the median age was 55, maybe close to 60. They were single person or maybe two people households. These are folks who've been in their homes for a while, and we were able to directly help permanently reduce, or for an extended period of time, reduce a fixed cost for them and maybe keep them in their home or help. Those ripples have those types of programs have ripple effects throughout the rest of the community, but we have to do it. We have to be intentional about it. It's not just going to happen by itself. And those are conversations that have to happen at the state and the local level. The second part of it, which I'll be quicker on, but it comes back to the that for community solar in particular, not making the program any harder than it has to be to engage. So the income verification standards is a great example, right? If somebody has to prove who they are 5 ways from Sunday and that they qualify to get 10% savings, that's not going to move the needle, right? The savings have to be greater, and the qualification process has to be simple. And that's happening and started to happen in Maryland, but constant attention needs to be paid by advocates in the state and regulators, just to make sure that part of the program works smoothly and continues to do so. And then connecting it to existing programs like energy efficiency and energy assistance programs, so that when you find a customer, that they can actually connect with other things that will also meaningfully impact their quality of life, whether it's energy assistance through the state or a rebate buy down on a new appliance, whatever the case may be. Once you've got someone's attention, we should be taking advantage of that and making sure that they're connected to as many services and assistance as possible.
Thank you, Corey. Delegate Charkoudian, what kind of advocacy is most impactful for you? How would you suggest organizations and constituents engage with your office on clean energy issues?
Have I ever not returned a phone call or an email on clean energy within 24 hours, Susan? Honestly. Just put clean energy in the subject line and I'm on it. I am sort of genuinely curious and interested in the issue, so I do tend to engage. I'm not sure if that's as helpful. I think coming back to the broader question of how, what's the best way to engage in general, I do think it's worth remembering that any given legislator has, 3,000 bills that are potentially in front of us, during a legislative session. And so this question about how do you get attention for a particular issue sometimes is challenging for advocates. I will say that for me personally, I like to work on my bills during the interim, so in April and May, I'll be starting these conversations that will eventually build to what I'll introduce in January. And that's both because I want to understand all the nuances of what I'm doing, but also because I want to, as much as possible, be building the coalition across a range of groups that could potentially be interested in the legislation. So I would say one tip, if you want to work with me in my office on legislation, is call me on April 15th, and we can start talking about next year. But I think that that's not a bad idea for other legislators as well. I do think there's a value to communicating and engaging with legislators during the sort of the off season about the broader concepts. I mean, even though you're not able to say like, this is, you know, I'm calling to ask for your support on, you know, HB 768, that's community choice energy, by the way. Even if you're not calling to ask for support on a particular bill, to be able to say, like, I want to talk to you about the concepts of energy efficiency and why they're so crucial to our clean energy future. I want to talk to you about the concepts of community solar and why it's crucial to getting a clean grid and equity together. Having those broader conversations, I think, during the interim puts you and us in a stronger position to then be able to narrow the focus on, okay, for this particular bill, what is it that we need to do to move it through the legislative session once session starts? And well, you know, legislators have other jobs. I think a lot of them are open to and willing to have conversations during the interim. And I think there's a real value to, especially just coming back to what I was saying earlier about the complexities of the energy world, having those broader sort of education conversations during the interim is helpful to create the foundation then for the legislative session once it arrives.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. One final question for both of you, very simple question. What should the DMV region learn about power grids and reliabilities based on the intense weather events that have happened elsewhere?
Well, I'm actually trying to get out an op-ed on that very topic. So look in the sun for, no, I'm just kidding. Okay, so I think, you know, I think the most important lesson, of course, is that if we don't address climate change, everything is at risk. You know, like strong and weak infrastructure, everything is at risk if we don't address climate change. So I think that the first and most important lesson is we've got to put front and center reducing our carbon emissions. And it's really important we don't lose that in this bigger conversation. But I think the rest of it is, you know, in some ways it comes back to this question about resilience and really looking for where resilience lines up with, you know, as I was saying, the same investments that give us more resilient grids are the same investments that bring more renewables on. The renewables can create that resilience, the peak shaving that's tied, the demand response, the efficiencies, the efficiency that we can create. And I think looking more and more for and articulating and communicating to the general public and to policymakers how what the nexus of all of those is really important, because it is the same investments that give us that resiliency that also can give us a cleaner grid if we do it right.
Thank you.
I guess maybe I could just add an example of that. I second all of what Delegate Charkoudian just said, is at all levels, utility, commercial, and residential level, we need to be making sure that people can like meaningfully invest in solar plus storage and be able to take advantage of not only the resiliency components of it, but the components to actually be able to support expansion of renewables in the grid. They're flexible resources, and right now, you know, they're slowly being adopted, but it'll speed up. And I think we all just need to make sure that there are policies in place that encourage that adoption and that the benefits actually just are distributed amongst all the investors at every level of the grid.
Thank you, Corey. We also have one attendee ask Corey for some information, and we'll forward that request to him. I didn't want the attendee to think that we had missed their question. Well, this completes our panel. I want to thank Delegate Charkoudian and Corey for all their help and all their very helpful answers to the questions, and they've given us some things to start working on, and we appreciate that. And thank you for your time and your expertise. And,
thank you.
And now I'm going to turn it over to David Barron, who will start our next panel on transportation electrification. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Susan. And good morning, everybody. This panel is on transportation electrification, and it's a really important issue. By some estimates, transportation is responsible for 20% of the greenhouse gas emissions from the district alone. And it's also one of our biggest sources of dangerous air pollutants like soot and smog. Just last summer, we saw a precipitous drop in unhealthy air days, and that was attributed primarily to a drop in people driving and commuting because of COVID. So we know there's a lot of potential there to protect people's health and to protect the planet by moving to electric vehicles. The District of Columbia has adopted a climate law providing for transition to zero emission vehicles by 2045 with interim steps along the way, requiring gradations of more and more electric vehicles, buses, trucks, and cars. And we've also seen commitments and statements from officials in the Maryland suburbs, in Maryland and Virginia, supporting vehicle electrification. At Earthjustice, we've been focusing especially on pushing WMATA to electrify the bus fleet. It's really low-hanging fruit. WMATA has a fleet of 1,500 buses. Most of them are diesel. Diesel emissions are recognized by some health organizations as carcinogenic. They're also dangerous from the standpoint of the air pollutants I mentioned before. And we're pushing for electrification because not only is it going to be good for our health and for the planet, but also it makes economic sense. As I think Jimmy will talk about in a bit, electric vehicles cost less in the long term. To discuss these and other issues, we have two excellent panelists here today. First, Jimmy O'Day, who is Senior Vehicles Analyst at the Union of Concerned Scientists and an expert on clean energy, clean vehicles and throughout the country. And Lindsey Mendelson, who is Transportation Representative for the Maryland chapter of the Sierra Club and who works to push for clean vehicles in Maryland. And I'm going to turn it over first to Jimmy to talk a little bit about what he does and what he's focusing on these days. Jimmy?
Yeah, great to be here, David, and really great to work with Right to Zero. So I'm an analyst at the Union of Concerned Scientists based in our Oakland, California office. Have been working on electrification of trucks and buses for the last 5 years, mostly in California with policies at the state level, where we've achieved policy victories requiring the state transit buses to transition to 100% zero emission vehicles. Most recently, last summer, we got a policy requiring truck manufacturers to sell electric trucks in California, and now currently working on a policy requiring fleets to actually purchase and use electric trucks in their operations. And as you know, these successes have occurred in California, it's starting to look outward, and really excited to see the DMV be on the next forefront of adopting these electrification policies.
Thanks, Jimmy. Lindsey, would you tell us a little bit about your position and what you're working on these days?
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me on, David. So yeah, hello everyone, Lindsey Mendelson with the Maryland Sierra Club. I'm the transportation representative, and we work on a variety of different issues in our transportation sector, including making sure that we're supporting public transit, making sure that it's well funded, making sure that it's also moving in the direction of electrification. And in addition to that, we're also focusing on other policies to reduce vehicle miles traveled, whether that's stopping the expansion of the I-495 and I-270 expansion plan here in Maryland, and also fighting for other smart growth and affordable housing policies as well. Specifically related to the electrification of the Maryland Transit Administration, which is the transit system that serves every county in Maryland and Baltimore City. WMATA is also, serves the region as well, but the Maryland Transit Administration serves primarily the greater Baltimore region, but also provides funding to locally operated transit systems. And we've been working over the last couple of years on what's called the Central Maryland Regional Transit Plan. This was the first regional transit plan in decades for the region. And it looks at the next 25 years of transit planning. And we had been working a lot on making sure that there's a strong plan to switch over MTA's buses and the locally operated transit systems in the greater Baltimore region. Originally, they had only been looking at a majority of those buses to be electric by 2045, and we actually pushed the Regional Transit Plan Commission and MTA to improve that by 95% by 2045. So we're really happy that that got in place, and we're making sure right now that that plan gets implemented. And we're also working as well on a bill that would help to transition MTA's bus fleet, making sure that we're locking in that commitment from MTA, where starting in 2023, any bus that is purchased could only be a zero emission bus. And that bill is sponsored by Delegate Corman and Senator Zucker.
Thanks, Lindsey. We're now going to discuss some questions for the panelists, and I'd like to remind all of the participants in the audience to put any questions they may have in the chat, and we'll ask those later in the discussion. And I'd like to start by discussing some policy opportunities for electrification in the District Maryland-Virginia area. That's when we say DMV, we're saying District Maryland-Virginia, in case somebody doesn't know the lingo or the acronym. And we know there's some really opportunities here. Lindsey's mentioned some of them. In addition to electrification of buses, motor vehicles of all sorts, trucks, cars, fleets, as Jimmy mentioned, and very, very few of those vehicles are in fact electrified in the region right now. So why don't we start with you, Jimmy? Could you share a little bit about the feasibility of bus and truck electrification and the truck memorandum of understanding to convert to zero emission buses and trucks, and any thoughts you might have on how we can make that happen in our region?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with the feasibility. Certainly the first question that folks have about electric trucks and buses. And I guess I'll say something that might surprise you or other folks, that electrification of trucks and buses, in my opinion, is actually more feasible than cars. I think there's a common misunderstanding that it's more difficult. And just to give you a sense of why I say that, most trucks and buses are operating in urban local environments. They're not doing long haul trips across regions or across state lines that people often have a mental image of long haul trucks. There's a lot of trucks that aren't long haul and operating in urban environments. And just one statistic around that, about 75% of trucks drive 30,000 miles a year or less. And on a per day basis, if you assume 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year, that's about 120 miles a day. So a lot of trucks are underneath that, kind of that 100-mile range day, which is really excellent for today's battery technology. And just for a sense of where things are at in that regard, Ford, they have their transit van, like the Sprinter van, like delivery van. They announced a 126-mile range for that van that they're going to offer for sale next year for $45,000. And the thing that makes electric trucks and buses also more feasible is the cost that you mentioned earlier, David. These vehicles, they drive enough miles that the fuel savings for electrification are very significant and offset diesel and gasoline expenses to the point where a vehicle can be more expensive to purchase up front, but the savings on fuel over time make that vehicle really cost competitive today and perhaps even lower total cost of ownership in the near future. So feasibility, there is just a ton there for trucks and buses. Every manufacturer is developing or testing electric trucks and buses. The issue is really getting these companies to bring them to market. And that's, I guess, transitioning to the question about policies. One of the biggest policies that a state can adopt is this policy called the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule that requires manufacturers to sell electric trucks in your state. This is a policy that we had passed in California last summer that I mentioned, and other states are considering adopting this currently. And that's where this truck MOU comes in that you mentioned. Over the summer, 15 states plus DC, so let's say 16 states for the DC statehood argument, 16 states signed this agreement, governors saying, hey, we're going to work together to collaboratively advance electrification of trucks. Pretty vague beyond that, just the sense of we're going to plan. So right now a plan is being put together for those 16 states to take actions on electrification of trucks and buses. That plan is expected to come out at the end of the year, and the states will then begin kind of choosing which policies they think are most suitable for their state. And so I would advocate that no matter what comes of that plan, states prioritize adoption of this policy, the Advanced Clean Trucks policy, to really get manufacturers to sell these vehicles in their state.
Thanks, Jimmy. Lindsey, what are the major transportation electrification opportunities in the near term in the region? And could you also discuss the regional transit plan?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the pieces of legislation that I mentioned that's a good vehicle for electrification is the Zero Emission Bus Transition Act, sponsored by Senator Zucker and Delegate Corman. And this bill, like I mentioned, requires that starting in 2023 that if the MTA is replacing a bus, that they replace that with a zero emission bus. So that contract has to be only for that purchase of that bus. In addition to that, one thing that's really important about the bill is that it also requires a plan to be developed for transitioning any state workers that are adversely affected by the changeover. And that's really important to make sure that the folks that are working on the buses, that they have also the training as well to be working on electric buses, given that there's just a different type of process than diesel buses. So that's one thing on the horizon, and it's actually looking very strong this year. That there's a standalone version of that bill, and there's also a version of that bill in the Climate Solutions Now Act. So we're really hoping that either it passes in the standalone bill, and also the Climate Solutions Now package passes with that establishment there. The other thing, I think you asked me to talk a little bit more about the regional transit plan. So there had been the impetus around the regional transit plan was a few years ago. Folks might have remembered that WMATA funding was passed both in the General Assembly in Maryland and also in DC and Virginia to require dedicated funding. At the same time, there were a lot of people that noticed that there wasn't a plan for funding the capital needs of MTA, and also really identifying a long-term plan for the region. And so that bill created the impetus behind that plan, and also just an inventory of what the needs are in the region. And so in October, the regional transit plan was released, building off of a couple years of work in terms of looking at the forecast for what's needed. And the important thing is once we got that provision that 95% of buses would be electric, not only in MTA's fleet, but also in the greater Baltimore region as well. That's really important because that allows a lot more, that gives you the political advantage. Once it's, on a plan, you can really defend that and say, okay, now we need to go forward and implement this. This is something that we need to have the funding for because the state has committed to it. So I think that that's something really important to keep in mind as well. So in terms of the next couple months, if folks want to make sure that the state implements this, including the provision that buses are going to be zero emission, they should write to both the Baltimore mayor and the county executives to have the regional transit plan have funding for MTA and make sure that that plan is implemented in their priority letters that they send to MDOT each year as part of their request. So I think that's one thing that's really important. The other thing that I also wanted to mention is folks may have seen that there was a historic announcement with Montgomery County having about 300 school buses that are going to be leased over the next decade or so, and that's actually a really unique financing model. So I'll make sure to drop the article in the chat here. There is a bill that's also related to that, sponsored by Delegate Fraser Hidalgo, that would require the Public Service Commission to deploy school buses in Maryland. Basically, they would cover the incremental costs, and the electric companies would have access to the storage of batteries. So the fact that the school buses can feed electricity back into the grid is actually really important and kind of allows for that flexibility as well. So we saw a success story of that in Montgomery County, and also looking to expand that to other places in Maryland. There's a bill that would do similar things with that. And I know that Maryland League of Conservation Voters and a lot of other folks have been working on that as well.
Thanks, Lindsey. Jimmy, what are the challenges in opposition to electrification from incumbent utilities, the fossil fuel industry, and how do these challenges compare in our region and in other places?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think it spans really all three topics that are being discussed on today's call with building electrification, clean energy, clean electricity, and clean transportation. Is really incumbent industries are really dug in and don't want to change. And in the transportation world, it's the incumbent vehicle manufacturers that put up the biggest fight and are continuing to put up the biggest fights against electrification that we've seen in California and are starting to see in other states. So these are under the auspices of their trade organization, the Engine Manufacturers Association is the largest voice against truck electrification. Utilities, we've seen different responses from utilities towards electrification. We certainly have some allies, I would say, in electrification with utilities. They have a business model to sell electricity, and electric vehicles can certainly play into that. There are utilities that also sell natural gas and electricity at the same time, and we've seen more conflicted messages of support from those utilities. And just looking from California's experience to now D.C., Maryland, Virginia, I expect the same arguments to hold true, or to exist, just on feasibility, on costs. We can't do this, we can't do it fast, and I think we're going to talk later about messages to combat those. But the opposition is not that creative. They're going to use the same arguments that we've seen in California, and it really is just the incumbents dug into their existing models of making money.
Just an additional question for you, Jimmy. What do we need to do, whether it's at the PSCs or elsewhere, to make sure we have the infrastructure in place to support transportation electrification?
Yeah, infrastructure is going to be critical for making this transition, and we need to start as soon as we can on getting policies and really construction projects in the pipeline to support this. There's, like anything, long lead times with construction projects, planning that needs to happen. And one of the biggest things really to get this infrastructure going is the signal that the electric trucks will be here, that they're coming. And so I'll go back to a policy I've mentioned a couple of times already, the Advanced Clean Trucks Standard, adopting that and sending the signal that a minimum number of electric trucks must be sold in DC, in Maryland, in Virginia, provides that signal that the infrastructure will be needed to support those trucks. Without that particular policy, or something signaling there will be X number of trucks on the roads by this year, it will be hard to get the infrastructure off the ground and policies to support that infrastructure.
Thanks, Jimmy. Lindsey, I think you've answered this question somewhat, but what are the key bills to watch in the Maryland legislative sessions, maybe beyond the ones that you've mentioned? Are there any that you didn't mention that we should know about?
Yeah, so I'm going to put in the chat, if you go to the transportation section of our testimony site, and I know Brian is one of the participants on this webinar, and he did a lot of great work to write a lot of his testimony, so I have to give him credit for that. So a few of the items to check out would be, one of them relates to the state vehicle electrification of the fleet. The other one relates to plug-in electric vehicles, reserved parking spaces. Other bills relate to allowing for vehicle recharging at multifamily units. A lot of the barriers for, I'm talking about passenger cars now, is just being able to have folks be able to utilize the charging infrastructure. So some of those bills just kind of relate to allowing that to happen in a better fashion, and then also looking at, what can we do with the state fleet?
Thanks, Lindsey. We have some questions from the audience. And this goes to both of you. How does equity and justice factor into this conversation? Who else needs to be involved to ensure every community benefits from electric transportation?
Yeah, so for that question, I think this type of work is a journey, right, for a lot of advocates in terms of how to center equity and justice in the whole entire process. And I think a lot of it comes down to making sure that the communities that are most impacted are the ones who are leading the charge on that. That whoever's working on that these types of issues consults with them directly, sees what their interests are, what they're looking to do, and then also engaging in community conversations and listening sessions. I also think that it's really important to have labor at the discussion, especially with the regards to when we're transitioning over to electric vehicles. There might be some impacts related to jobs, and also just retraining because the buses are different, and so the maintenance of that is different, so that's really important. And the other thing that we've also been kind of learned through our conversation with other advocates as well, working on transit justice, is just really making sure that we're vigilant with when the contracts are arranged, and that it really is only a one-to-one replacement, so that we can make sure that in no way would service be reduced at all because of the transition to electrification. So really making sure that there's smart planning involved, so that not only do we make the buses cleaner, but we also make sure that people have the same level of service so that they can get to jobs and get to healthcare, recreation, all the things that they need to in a timely fashion as well.
Thanks, Lindsey. Jimmy, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, this certainly really gets to the crux of the issue of deploying vehicles in communities that are most impacted by existing vehicle emissions. One strategy around that is whenever there's incentive funding available for deploying these vehicles, requiring that a given percentage of that incentive funding directly benefit communities most burdened by pollution. We have policies like that in California that have been very successful and they've been overachieved, I guess, in the percentages that have been set. So in the neighborhood of 50% of incentive fundings given out have been vehicles deployed in communities impacted by pollution. The other side of the coin is just high ambition, strong ambitions from policies. If we really want to reduce pollution burdens and make the transition to clean air and the healthy world that we want to see, we need the strongest ambition and fastest timelines as possible. And so really not backing down from pushback to delay and to go slow on these policies.
Thanks, Jimmy. This is a question for both of you also. What are the messages we can use to counter the opposition to that we've been seeing and will inevitably see to electrification? What's going to resonate with folks? Lindsey, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I definitely think that it's important to put the public health and the equity messages front and center on this. The other thing is, we've been realizing as we've been going through this process is there's been, other legislators asking things, they talk about the financing of it, how it's going to, cost more money. They're going to talk about how, what happens in the cases of emergencies when like the grid is down. So they're going to bring up all these different things. And we always like to point to New York as an example for that, because especially in a place that's much colder, than Maryland in general, there's a lot of great success stories and just other success stories of places in the region where it has worked really well. And I think that's really helpful because, a lot of times they're going to put forward this narrative of, oh, this is going to be too impossible, too costly. And there's just so many success stories of this happening close by in the region, or even, in different counties and cities. So I think that's one thing to also point to as well.
Jimmy?
Yeah, messages that strike me are, echoing what Lindsey said about the need. The need is real. The technology is here. I think that's something that is not well understood, or gets, people use these edge cases like Lindsey maybe mentioned about, super cold days or, snow plows or something. Like, can't electrify snow plows, and that's not necessarily what we're asking. And the urgency that we have to act today. And, there's going to be lags and time to get, things set up. So just having those delays built in naturally for any transition, when you kind of back calculate from, where we want to get to, 100% vehicles on the road in the next decade and a half, 2 decades-ish, it really points to action today. And so in addition to the messages, I guess I'd also emphasize the messengers, and having as many messengers as possible, really singing this tune that we need this transition, we need zero emission technologies, is critically important. Having a wide breadth of groups and people calling for this change is ultimately what will push these policies to being approved and adopted.
Thanks to both of you. Here's another question from the audience. Environmental groups seem to have forgotten that more trains need to be electrified. What's being done to advance train electrification? Either of you have an answer for that one?
Yeah, I think that, one of the concerns is that the MARC system, they actually switched over to some diesel vehicles, which was not, the greatest investment in the world. So I do think it's also important to make sure, we can't necessarily, it's harder to replace kind of the things that are like halfway through their lifetime now, but for any future vehicle replacements, making sure that they're electric is really important. And we know that there's this huge maintenance backlog, for MTA. There's a lot of vehicles being replaced, and making sure that they, when there are new replacements, that they don't replace them with diesel locomotives, I think is really important in fighting for that in the procurement process.
Jimmy, do you have any thoughts on that?
Train electrification is certainly an area that's a little further than things I usually focus on. That, yeah, it's possible. And trains are a huge source of diesel particulate pollution. So yeah, addressing them is critically important.
I had a follow-up question for you on electrification generally, Jimmy, which is sometimes people say or wonder if electrification is necessarily all that clean if the source of the electricity is a coal-fired power plant. I think you've done some work on that, haven't you?
Yeah, that's a question we get a lot, and I spend a lot of time thinking about. And the short answer is everywhere in the United States, no matter what grid you're charging from, an electric truck is cleaner than a diesel truck on a life cycle emissions basis. It certainly is better if you're getting electricity from cleaner sources, and the work of Right to Zero campaigns on clean electricity in the region are critically important, and we're certainly not to where we need to be on clean electricity yet. But today it is better to have an electric truck than a diesel truck on a life cycle basis.
Thanks, Jimmy. Paul Court put a comment in the chat that the challenge on trains is federal preemption. We're working on petitions to EPA to require zero emission locomotives. I think we are just about out of time. I'll ask one more quick question, which is charging infrastructure. If you go around town and if you have an electric vehicle, the cost to charge your electric vehicle can vary wildly from charger to charger. What can we do about that to make sure that people aren't gouged when they're trying to get their EV charged?
Yeah, I guess this is an area where actions at public utility commissions and oversight of utilities and electricity rates is really important. Electricity rates for electric trucks and buses almost across the board today, were not designed for those vehicles. They were set for commercial electricity users, industrial electricity users. And just like we've seen across the country, utilities adopting electricity rates specific for electric cars when people are charging at their homes, utilities need to offer and set rates for charging electric trucks and buses that don't price gouge and are fair and allow an operator to save money on fuel compared to diesel.
Thanks to both of our panelists. We're out of time. Thank you, Lindsey Mendelson. Thank you, Jimmy O'Day. It was an excellent panel. We're now going to transition to the discussion on buildings. And I'm going to remind people to answer the poll questions and I want to reintroduce Susan Stevens-Miller, who is going to lead the buildings panel.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon, everyone. Our third and final panel of the day will discuss switching to healthy all-electric buildings. Once again, we have three great experts to lead this discussion. David Smetic is the Senior Campaign Representative for the Mid-Atlantic region of Sierra Club. David implements and manages Sierra Club's climate action initiatives to move beyond fossil fuels to clean energy in the Mid-Atlantic, and is helping to build a movement that drives states and local jurisdictions off dirty fuels like coal and frack gas to a more just, clean energy economy. Jamal Lewis is the Senior Policy and Technical Assistance Specialist at Green and Healthy Homes Initiative. For those of you who are unfamiliar with GHI, GHI was created and now implements a holistic intervention model to integrate lead hazard control, healthy homes, and weatherization and energy efficiency work. Jamal is the lead for GHI's energy efficiency portfolio and also works on the organization's national lead campaign to end childhood lead poisoning. I highly recommend Jamal's recent paper, Energy Efficiency as Energy Justice, Addressing Racial Inequalities Through Investments in People and Places. And last but not least, we have Mr. Jim Gravett. Jim is the managing consultant at Energy Futures Group. Jim has served as an expert witness on behalf of environmental and social equity advocates in utility proceedings across the United States. Jim has experience with market-based approaches to design and managing energy efficiency programs, including the multifamily and low-income residents. He's a trusted and valued energy efficiency expert on behalf of the Maryland Energy Efficiency Advocates. Once again, I'd like to remind everyone to please share any questions you may have in the Q&A box. And first, I would like to ask each of our panelists to provide a brief overview of their current work and priorities. David, let's start with you.
Sure thing. Thank you, Susan. And thank you to Earthjustice for organizing this entire midday session on the Right to Zero. It's really, really exciting. So again, as Susan noted, I'm David. I'm with the Sierra Club. When it comes to building electrification in the Mid-Atlantic and the DMV, it's really climbing up our priority list. I think, as we've looked at a declining emissions from the electric sector, recognizing the need to really clean our homes and businesses from indoor air quality perspective and from addressing climate pollution, it's really critically important. So what are we doing to update our building codes? What are we doing to incentivize the deployment of air source and ground source heat pumps to displace the amount of fracked gas, fossil gas, and other combustible fossil fuels? What are we doing to do that? What are the changes to our energy efficiency programs that need to be updated? What additional proceedings in front of public service commissions and utilities commissions do we need to intervene in and start to make sure we're making those changes? And what other processes are going on in the state? What climate action planning discussions are happening? We're really trying to get our feet wet in all of those different areas and really looking at, okay, what does the 2030 climate action plan for Maryland look like? What does the 2050 carbon neutrality plan for the District of Columbia look like? What are the bill impacts of the new Virginia Clean Energy Economy bill look like when it comes to the building sector? So all sorts of things we're really trying to dive in head first into this sector, and really excited to talk with you all about it today. Happy to dive into it more soon, but I'll pass it over to maybe Jim to talk about this section for him too.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Susan and Jill, for letting me be here today. I'm excited about it, and excited about where this industry is going. I've been working on energy efficiency for a few decades, and when I started, it was really about using less energy, and I think our ambitions were fairly modest. A lot of the work that I've done has been trying to convince regulators and utilities to do, if you're going to do energy efficiency, you can do more and you can do it better. And that's good, and it's important, but it's a small part of the big picture, really critical, but only a piece of the big picture. And I think now we're, in the last few years, moving rapidly to fold in much bigger climate goals into how this all fits together. And I think it does fit together, and not only bigger climate goals, but also social equity, racial equity goals as part of energy equity. So really exciting times. The consulting firm I work for, Energy Futures Group, we almost exclusively work for environmental and social equity advocates. We don't tend to work for utility companies. I don't know why they don't hire us, but maybe because we tend to sit on the other side of the proceedings often enough. And I like it that way. So excited to work with everybody. everybody on this panel.
And now Jamal.
Thanks. Yeah. So again, thanks to Earthjustice and the team for putting this on. It's really great to see you, Susan, and to connect with Jim and David once again. And thanks for the introduction, Susan. GHHI, we are a community-based organization based out of Baltimore, but we do advocate for broader policies and program design and implementation that that ensure that everyone has access to a safe, healthy, and energy efficient home. And so what that means in this context is that a lot of our priorities have to do with increasing access to energy efficiency, weatherization, and clean energy. And one of the primary barriers that we aim to address is by increasing or improving housing conditions and alleviating health and safety, which is often a barrier to deep building shell energy efficiency retrofits. And so, as Susan alluded to, we do have a model where we align, braid, and coordinate resources to, address lead poisoning in the home or lead exposure in the home, asthma triggers, which can include mold, mildew, moisture, and aging in place, and leveraging those resources with energy efficiency and weatherization, so that those families and households who are most impacted by substandard housing, high energy bills, and are most impacted by the impacts of climate change are able to benefit from healthy, safe, energy efficient, and affordable housing. So in terms of our priorities, Delegate Charkoudian was on earlier and talked about one of her pieces of legislation, which establishes a low-income savings goal that a group of advocates, including David, and Susan has been working on for a number of years. And Jim actually has been the one leading that effort as well through the Public Service Commission. And what that goal does is, so it establishes a low-income savings goal, and what it does is start to prioritize and direct resources to limited income households in Maryland to drive more savings for those households. The state of Maryland has a 2% energy consumption savings target for the entire state, and what we found through the commission filings is that most of those savings are accruing in non-low income households. And what we know about savings is that in order to get those savings, there's more energy efficient measures that are installed, perhaps building shell measures, tightening the envelope and keeping hot air in the winter, cold air in the summer. And those savings with those savings, our broader benefits can accrue. And so what we're trying to do is get more of those savings to accrue in limited income households in Maryland. And the bill does that. And the other thing that the bill does is establishes a green and healthy task force, which the Department of Housing and Community Development would administer, but other state departments like the Maryland Department of Environment, the Maryland Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and others, and other interested stakeholders like advocates would be able to come together and say, how can we make sure that everyone in the state can access clean energy and energy efficiency, and how can we do that in the most efficient and effective way? And so the bill also includes that task force, which is, again, one of our priorities right now. So I will leave it there. I'm sure we'll get into a lot of the other nitty gritty, but I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you, Jamal. Now I'd like to throw out some questions to get the conversation started. I'm going to ask one panelist a question, but certainly if And either of the other panelists would like to weigh in and make a comment on any of the questions, I would certainly encourage that. David, let's start with you. What's the interplay between electrifying buildings and mitigating the impacts of climate change?
Yeah, thanks, Susan. Great question. So I'll start with, in Maryland as an example. Recently, the state, even just about a week and a half ago, released their 2030 Climate Action Plan and identified just how critically important building electrification and getting fossil fuels out of our buildings is for solving the climate crisis. In the state of Maryland, at least, the amount of pollution from the combustion of gas, oil, propane, other fossil fuels in our buildings and particularly our homes and our businesses is roughly equivalent to the same amount of carbon pollution that's coming out of our coal-fired power plants in the state. It's a pretty massive number. We're talking almost 10 million metric tons of carbon dioxide pollution, for those of you that like the numbers there. It's really substantial. And so in order to actually hit the goals that we need to, in order to meet climate action targets for, whether it's international targets, state level laws, or even locality laws, in Montgomery County as an example, we really need to start electrifying our buildings. So what that means is looking at changing primarily our heating sources and our boilers or furnaces in our homes and our businesses to efficient heat pump technologies. So air source and ground source heat pumps. Delegate Charkoudian earlier in the day was talking about her geothermal ground source heat pump that she was installing in her home. Those kinds of technologies, and especially these efficient air source heat pumps now that can work in colder climates, those are the kinds of technologies that we really need to be ramping up across the DMV. So I know that in the District of Columbia, it's a key portion of their 2050 climate action and carbon-free DC plan is electrifying the building stock. We have to be getting especially fossil gas out of our buildings and using these newer technologies if we have any hope of meeting those climate action targets. So again, happy to dive into more details on that about different policies and different factors for those, but it's very clearly articulated in the 2050 carbon-free DC draft plan that's out and the Maryland 2030 climate action plan that we have to be getting those fossil fuels out of our buildings in a really effective way in the next couple of decades.
Thank you, David. As a follow-up to that, how is the DC Commission doing with trying to implement those type of policies that the DC Council is adopting?
Great question, Susan. I would say they have some room to grow, to put it nicely. I think that the DC Commission really needs to dig their teeth into the specific orders and actions that the utilities need to be taking to meet those 2050 climate action targets. So one example, Washington Gas and Light, the gas utility primarily in the district, was required as a part of a merger settlement to put forward a 2050 climate business plan that would meet the district's carbon neutrality and fossil free targets for 2050. That climate business plan just bluntly failed. They still have almost, I think, 40% of their business relying on fossil gas. That is clearly out of line with the district's laws and what's governing their movement forward. And so the commission kind of just said, well, they checked the box, they submitted this plan, that's all that was required. We now need them to say, well, that plan's not enough. We need to have a really dedicated look at what's going to happen to the gas utility system and the distribution system in the District of Columbia. And right now we don't have that leadership in that direction from the commission on it. They're required to consider climate in their decision making, thanks to some new legislative efforts, but we're really missing that leadership from the commission on what's the pathway forward to actually handle this. Because what Washington Gas and Light has put forward is not meeting the district's climate goals. It simply will not do that. So we now need a lot more direction from the commission down in DC.
Thank you. Jim, what is currently happening with energy efficiency, and are policymakers making the necessary connections between energy efficiency and reaching zero carbon emissions? And if not, what in your view needs to be done to help them make those connections?
Well, that's a big question. I can tell you what's happening now in energy efficiency. At least this isn't everything that's happening, because I think there are a lot of things that happen outside of the commission regulation and outside of a state government but what's happening that's being driven through the Maryland Public Service Commission is Empower Maryland, which is a program that's required for the 5 large electric utilities in the state. WGL also participates as a gas utility, and the Department of Housing and Community Development provides energy efficiency programs to limited income households. So Empower Maryland, as Jamal said, has a 2% per year annual savings target, which is a fairly aggressive target compared to other states. It's not the highest in the country, but it's on the higher side, let's say. And Maryland Energy Administration runs a few programs as well. These programs are very, I mean, they started in 2008 before there was a whole lot of public discussion about climate change, or at least nowhere near the amount there is now. And so they're very targeted on energy efficiency, using less. They were targeted to mitigating what was going to happen with the grid and with the lack of electric generation if we didn't become more efficient in the state. We were going to look at rolling brownouts. We were going to look at having to build new power plants, expensive infrastructure investments that were going to cost ratepayers a lot of money and a lot of inconvenience. And so the legislature directed the commission to implement Empower with some savings targets, and those programs have continued since then, and pretty effectively. But the needs are bigger now. Now we need to save the planet. And so energy efficiency, in the way we've looked at it historically, is too narrow a view. So one of the things that we've advocated for the commission is to direct the utilities to consider climate goals and the climate impacts of the work they do in their energy efficiency planning. The commission said, well, you know, there's nothing that's stopping them from doing that now, but didn't specifically direct them to do it. However, you know, so there's a new 3-year plan was just approved for the utilities. We, and actually some of the utilities, suggested that the commission should open a proceeding to think about Empower goals starting in 2024. Should they continue to be framed just in electric and gas savings, or should they look at broader climate goals? And the commission has opened a proceeding to investigate that. And it sounds like Delegate Charkoudian is also working on the legislative side to bring that direction into commission planning. Maybe I'll stop there. I think, you know, let me stop there, because otherwise I'll take up the whole time.
Thank you, Jim. Jamal, I think you touched on this at the beginning, but how does building electrification impact low-income customers, and how can we create a more equitable approach to building electrification?
That's a great question, and I think there's a number of different ways to do that. You know, I love this campaign, Right to Zero, and I think it's really important that we do get to zero, but how we do that is also really important. So we, in the nuts and bolts of how we can electrify, particularly existing buildings, which is the subset that GHHI focuses on, we know that low-income households and you know, households of color occupy older, more deteriorated housing stock with fossil fuel appliances and infrastructure. And so, and we also know through research and anecdotal evidence that it costs more in a lot of cases to electrify older, deteriorated housing stock. So one, and this gets at why, you know, most of the savings through Empower accrue to non-low-income households. It's easier to retrofit either newer or households that are not deteriorated, that have had adequate maintenance. So because it's you know, it can be perceived as more costly, a lot of times resources don't get allocated to address these types of issues in households who can stand to benefit the most. So it is important that as we're thinking about electrification, we are targeting resources to those same households that can benefit the most from these investments. And that often may mean that housing conditions, health and safety hazards have to be addressed in the process. So that's one way, is generating more resources to improve housing conditions. The other is thinking about energy affordability in the process too. So in a lot of areas, in most areas, gas is actually more affordable than electricity, at least at this point. And so as we are electrifying, it is important that there is a lens towards energy affordability, particularly if we're targeting resources to lower income communities of color and other disadvantaged communities, that we're not just electrifying and then now they're paying 3 times more for their energy, right? So it's important that that there is a lens towards affordability. And when I say that, I mean, and this, Pennsylvania is starting to look at this. New York has a policy looking at this. And I'm sure most of our audience is aware of the concept of energy burden. It's the percentage or proportion of income that is spent on utilities. In New York, there's a policy that is designed to limit someone's energy burden at 6%. So 6% of their total income is spent on utilities, and that's what's considered affordable by the broader energy sector. And the way that that's achieved is through programs like the LIHEAP program that's administered in New York. So there is a subsidy that households who pay more than 6% on their utilities can benefit from in order to get their energy burden down to 6%. It's something like that, which you know is an opportunity for Maryland, D.C, and Virginia to put into place, so that as we're getting to zero, we are also not negatively impacting the people in the households that have long been impacted by these issues, nonetheless. So those are 2 ways. There are many other ways thinking about the health impacts, but I also can talk about this for a long time. So I will stop and we can move on.
Thank you. Now I have a question for all the panelists, but we can start with David. How do we counter the opposition we've been seeing from the gas industry? What messages do decision makers need to hear to counter this growing opposition?
Yeah, great question, Susan. Thanks. And there's like you could probably have a multi-day workshop on some of this. So I'll bleed into one specific thing that Jamal was alluding to toward the end of his most recent comments was the public health angle. I think that we know that when you combust a fossil fuel in your home, you're going to degrade your indoor air quality. And that even is true for fossil gas. So when we're looking at things like, you know, it's probably the most charged conversation to have around building electrification. When you're looking at your stoves in your homes, there's a lot of research that shows the negative impact on indoor air quality and associated respiratory diseases like asthma, what a gas stove has on your public health in your home. So I think that really tying, you know, your children's health, your lungs to the combustion of a fossil fuel inside a home in your building, it's really critically important for the general populace to start to understand that, so that we can begin to counter the idea that everybody just is great if you start burning something in your home. So I recognize it's like a really politically charged portion there, but I do think that's one of the areas that you can start countering the work from the gas industry associated with that, is just talking about what matters to you, what you're breathing every single day of your life.
Can I add to that, if I may?
Yes, please.
You know, I think another thing holding the gas industry accountable is that they are doing studies now about renewable natural gas, biogas, and spinning the potential in a way that makes it look like, you know, this could really help us out a lot. But even the gas industry studies, when you look at them, show that to make any material impact in replacing the current natural gas supply, the cost would be phenomenally more expensive. And that's not talking about replacing all of the current fossil gas. That's, you know, a relatively small fraction. So very, very much more expensive than electric alternatives. And, you know, and still not actually, that wouldn't really do anything for the indoor air quality that we're talking about with that David's talking about with burning appliances in our home, unvented appliances. So I think holding the gas industry to high technical requirements, you know, countering their stories with real evidence is pretty important.
And I'll add, I just put a link in the chat from the news article from a study that links fossil fuel pollution to about 1 in 5 deaths that occur each year. So just in terms of messaging, what Earthjustice with the Right to Zero campaign and many of us are trying to do is say, you know, this is really important for our collective health and well-being. And if we don't act now, again, 1 in 5 deaths will attribute globally will be attributed to fossil fuel pollution. So we have to address this now.
Jamal, could you expand on that with regard to, I think David mentioned it a little bit, the use of gas stoves and the effect on indoor air quality for the use of gas appliances in the home?
Yeah. I mean, I echo what David said. I mean, it's really important that we are looking at the home or buildings itself as a whole. So thinking about not only the energy infrastructure, but also other sources of air pollution that can pollute the air and negatively impact our health. So, you know, obviously the source of heat in the home, the stove, is important. That lead to poor indoor air quality. But also, I think it's really important that we, in the broader context of this, remember that in the equity conversation too, it's important that we are collectively reducing the load on our grid, which can lead to greater resilience and ultimately lead to, you know, if we're looking at situations that like what happened in Texas, even though there's a lot there, reducing load on our grid can help us to ensure that we are able to produce enough energy for the demand. And one way to do that is by addressing the building shell and making sure that it's more efficient and that we are able to maximize the energy that we are using. And when we do that, we are again able to mitigate other indoor air pollutants such as mold, mildew, and moisture, which also have a negative impact, as David mentioned, on individuals that have asthma. So looking at the whole building, the whole home as one environment and trying to do our best to alleviate sources of poor indoor air quality. And I'll just mention one tangential priority that I neglected to mention earlier was the fact that there is legislation that was introduced in the Maryland General Assembly to establish a mold inspection and remediation standard. And, you know, that is really, really huge if we're thinking about it. So mold is like one of the primary reasons for deferrals of energy efficiency, and it has tremendous health impacts. So if property owners, particularly for rental properties, if property owners are required to inspect and remediate mold, that's huge in terms of when we're thinking about building retrofits and really targeting resources to households that can benefit the most. So, you know, the stove issue, it is a contested topic. There's a lot of health impacts that are associated with gas stoves, heating, but I also want to bring to the conversation the discussion of mold and mildew.
Thank you, Jamal. One final question for all three of our panelists. What do you see as the opportunities that are coming up, and how would you recommend others, particularly attendees on this discussion, get involved in those opportunities?
Well, I'll start, if I may. As I said, the Public Service Commission has initiated a proceeding with an administrative law judge to consider what kind of goals should be put in place for Empower for the next cycle starting in 2024. So I think there is an opportunity there to advocate for carbon goals instead of just megawatt hour savings and therm savings. There's an opportunity there to advocate for social equity goals, racial equity goals, targeting disadvantaged communities. I think the opportunity is large, but it's a very rapid timeline. They have to have a report by April 15th, and I have not yet seen any notice of meetings. But we can, just trying to think what the easiest way is to get the information to people about who to contact, who the administrative law judge is who's leading this proceeding, and to say, I would like to be included on the distribution list for these meetings because I'd like to participate. I think that would be one good place to start.
I'll jump in really quickly as well with two opportunities. So in Maryland, in addition to what Jim mentioned, which is critically important on a short timeline, the other one is the Maryland Commission on Climate Change is a public stakeholder group with state agencies, industry representatives, members of the public, and a whole host of folks. They are initiating, they've soft launched it in February, but in March, they're having their first more bigger formal meeting on an energy transition plan for Maryland's building stock. And it's continuing throughout most of the year. So they had a mini version over like a 4-month period last year on it. And there's a report, I'll put it in the chat here, some additional information on this, but the Commission on Climate Change is hosting a pretty robust stakeholder process on this. And then locally in the District of Columbia, there's a lot of different conversations going on. I encourage folks to look at the Public Service Commission's website for different proceedings that are ongoing, talking about the building sector and decarbonization, as well as, there's various actions that, locally at Sierra Club we're doing with the D.C Sustainable Energy Utility, asking them to stop gas incentives, all sorts of things like that. So that's my 2 cents though.
Yeah, and for me, I'll just ping Delegate Charkoudian's bill again. We are trying to get that low-income savings target in place. So feel free to reach out to Delegate Charkoudian or your local representatives, to particularly the ones on Economic Matters Committee, to put your good favor in. The other is the mold bill. The sponsor of that is Delegate Henson in the House. So reach out to Delegate Henson on that. And I also just want to point out that just to echo some of the points made by Jim and David earlier, it is important that we are looking at this holistically. So thinking about health, affordability, in addition to electrification and decarbonization. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is talk to anchor institutions like hospitals, like banks, that have a responsibility to provide resources to their local communities, and see how can they leverage resources to improve the building stock to ultimately lead to a cleaner future for all of us and all of our neighbors. So just wanted to make a plug for that too.
Well, I'd like to thank all three of our panelists. I think this has been a great discussion with plenty of information and probably plenty of need for more information. So thanks to the three of you for joining us this afternoon. And now I'm going to turn it over to Paul Court, who's the director of the Right to Zero campaign, and let him finish us out.
All right. Well, thank you all again. Again, my name is Paul Court. I direct the Right to Zero campaign at Earthjustice. And I just want to, again, thank the panelists for a great discussion. And it's just always inspiring to kind of see how this work is all coming together. The Right to Zero campaign grew out of recognition that clean transportation, clean buildings, and a clean grid were not just about climate, not just about carbon emissions, but about health, about air quality, about environmental justice, and that we needed to talk not just about zero carbon, but zero emissions. And it also came out of a realization that a zero emission future was actually now within our grasp, and it's not crazy to demand going right to zero. And that all of these things are connected: transportation electrification, building electrification, and the grid to support it. Electrifying everything means that we need, we can't shift to dirty power. Transitioning away from fossil fuels and combustions means that we have to cut those fossil fuel lifelines in every sector. And electrifying our buildings and our transportation will actually support a resilient grid, but we need to invest in that grid in order to support building and transportation electrification. And all of this is a drumbeat. And as we sort of add to these victories, as we sort of move through electrifying buses, we can then talk about electrifying trucks, and electrifying trucks we can talk about demanding electric cars and electric trains, and all of it is now sort of, again, becoming a louder and louder message that really is the creation of all of this work. And so, our hope is there are so many opportunities now in the DMV region that we can start to sort of compile those victories and put them together in a broader zero emission vision for the region and for the country. And so we really want to encourage folks to keep this conversation going, to build these partnerships, to see how this work overlaps. So we'd encourage you, if you have additional questions for any of the panelists, for any of us at Earthjustice, to feel free to reach out through email. As we mentioned at the beginning, don't forget to follow us and the conversation on Twitter at right2TO0ZERO DMV. And really, we look forward to organizing more of these events, hopefully, someday in person, and kind of sharing in each other's victories, because again, it all adds up to achieving, I think, a just and clean future. So until the next event, until we talk to each other again, stay safe. And again, thank you all for joining.